Morning, guys. So 3.3 is the final part of inquiry question 1. What are the causes of globalisation and why has it accelerated in recent decades? This whole section is looking at why some places might be more affected by globalisation than others. So we start by looking at just how globalisation is measured, almost a recap of what you did in 3.1. So thinking about flows, technologies and movements, and then media. So some countries are more switched on to having one of these four or all of these four or a combination of these four in their country, and therefore are more likely to have globalization of some kind. We can then think about the two different ways in which we can measure globalization. So we call the Koff index and the Kearney index. So the Koff and Kearney index are different and they have different ways of looking at and measuring globalization. The Koff index focuses on economic, social, political, and then also how they work it out. So economic, they think about what actually are the cross-border transactions and the volume of FDI. Social thinks about the contact cross-border as well as information flows. Political looks more at things like embassies. And then how do they work out the rank? They have indicated for different importances. And then depending on which of those is the highest means that they are the most globalised area. So task 3 then asks the question, why do you think 13 of the top 15 countries of the Koff index are in Europe? And it's mainly because it is a Euro-centred or a Eurocentric measure of globalisation. So it's based in Germany. And so process around European countries. Therefore, it's likely that those countries that are found in Europe are part and are higher in that index. Task 4 then looked at the advantages and disadvantages of these different indexes. So an advantage is it allows comparisons. It has a wide range of globalisation data available. It uses a weighting system to take into account missing data and rebalances discrepancies because not all countries collect data in exactly the same way. It's also been used since the 1970s, so we've got a long historical record of this data. However, some of the disadvantages, the internet can skew data. You then have a bias, so smaller countries may be overrepresented, so for example, Belgium. Information economies and illegal immigrants are not included. And these are those at the top better. Globalisation doesn't always mean better. So the second index is the Kearney index or the AT Kearney index. And this is set up over 4 main principles. So political engagement, technological connectivity, personal contact, and economic integration. The country is participating in international treaties and organisations, and that is seen as a high political engagement. We then have technology, so this looks at the number of internet users, hosts, servers, etc. Personal contact, so travel, telephone call, and remittance, so money sent back from one area to another, and then also looks at the volumes of international trade and FDI. So advantages and disadvantages of these two then. So advantages, it covers 84% of the world's population, covers 96% of the world's GDP, allows comparison between countries, allows comparison over time. However, some of the disadvantages is weighting, so who actually decides which parts are highest weighted. There are only 64 countries actually included. And how do you actually measure cultural trends? Explain the differences between the Koff and Kearney index. The Kearney index uses more holistic indicators, whereas the Koff index focuses more on numbers and figures. So the next section is looking at how do TNCs contribute to the spread of globalisation and take advantage of economic liberalisation. So this is using the Oxford textbook. 4 different key terms. So how actually do TNCs contribute to the spread of globalisation and take advantage of economic liberalisation? So GPN or Global Production Network, this is a network of interconnected functions, operations and transactions through which a product or service is produced. So for example, when you are making a car, each of those different car parts are made in different parts of the country or in different countries. They're then bought all together in one place and put together to make a car. Outsourcing, so this is contracting work to another separate company. So you might specialise, if you're making a car, you might specialise in wing mirrors. You might then have a contract with Mini for you to make their wing mirrors and send them to their networks. So new markets, this is looking at new populations of consumers reached by expanding ideas. And then finally, we have offshoring. So this when a company does work overseas or outsources internationally. Task 9 was just getting you to think about motive, mobility, and means. And what this is how globalization is increasing through TNCs. So TNCs have all three of those things, and the most successful TNCs will use all three of these in a really, really, really conducive way, which leads to them being and becoming world leaders. So economic liberalisation really means that the economic markets have freed up so that there is more ability for companies to move between those different areas. Finally, LA3 is looking at switched on, switched off places. I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail with these, but when we think about switched on and switched on have globalisation and are actively involved in it. Switched off may have access to globalisation but not actually be involved in it. Switched on and switched off doesn't have to be just one country. So the UK, for example, there are parts that are massively switched on to globalisation, so somewhere like London, whereas there are parts of the UK which are massively switched off. So if you think about the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, lots of people there won't have access to the level of globalisation that we have in London. When we think about switched on and switched off, it is the difference between having good connections, good economic development, high standard of living, and then switched off focuses more on countries that almost feel like they've been left behind. So when we sort these out into physical and human, so the physical factors are 1, 6, and 7. Human factors are 2, 3, 4, and 9. And then ones that are both are 5, 8, and 10. So when we think about stereotypical view is Africa is seen as a non-globalized place. There can't surely be globalization there because it's so rural and so remote. And that's not true. If you think back to your GCSE study that you did if you did the LXL board, is we looked at Lagos in Nigeria, super switched on region. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because a country or a continent seems less switched off, doesn't instantly mean all countries and all regions within it are. So your two case studies of Zambia and Tanzania both are examples of places that found it difficult to switch on. It's not to say that they're not switched on to globalisation, but they just found it more difficult and they encountered more issues. Task 16 is looking at, is there any evidence to suggest that they are switching on? And this is where we're starting to see often the cities and the capital regions becoming more switched on to globalisation, and then the rural regions are left out of that. Hopefully you got a chance to watch the video in Task 17. It's just interesting, something for you guys to think about. Next week, you're going to be moving on to 3.4, which is part of the EQ2 topic.